So now we're going to move on to a bonus chapter on this concept of standalone components. Now, standalone components was introduced in Angular version 14 and will continue to be improved in future versions. Now, this concept of standalone doesn't just apply to components. We can apply this standalone knowledge to things such as our services and pipes and our directives. Now, before we go into what this standalone API looks like, it's important to understand why we're actually going to have this standalone behavior. Now, from the inception of Angular, we have these things called ng modules. We create an ng module by adding the ng module decorator. We can then declare some components. We can tell Angular what kind of modules we're then going to import, set our routing definitions, and then sprinkle that on top of a class as so. This then, if we jump inside our main, gets imported. We use this platform browser dynamic. We bootstrap a particular module and catch any errors. Now, this is all great, and this idea of a standalone component is a relatively new idea, but it essentially allows us to move away from this module idea. Now, this isn't going to necessarily replace ng modules. This gives you a different flavor. So from the get-go, this is a very important topic to discuss. This isn't, at least in the very short term and the medium term, going to replace ng modules, which is why we've included them in this course. ng modules are a great way of developing our Angular applications. It might be that if you're building directives, for example, as part of an open source library, you want to then turn to using this standalone approach. Perhaps in the future, modules will be removed, but for now we get to see a developer preview of these standalone features. Now, first this gets applied to our standalone components. At the moment, we have these components, such as our app component. We then go into our module. We then import the app component, pass it to the module, and then tell Angular that this is our root module to be then bootstrapped. Now, when it comes to standalone components, what we're essentially going to do is move this particular logic. So here we have the browser module, the HTTP client module, the router. All of these kind of definitions are going to be then bound to the components instead, which will then remove the need for an ng module. Now, it's completely up to you what you want to do, whether you want to develop your Angular applications with an ng module approach or this standalone approach. Now, what I want to do is first show you how to generate a standalone component, and then we're going to discuss the API. So I'm going to boot up another terminal instance here. Now, because we are using the Angular CLI, we're going to use npx ng. So this is then going to Angular, and we're going to say G for generate, C for component, and we can pass this -- standalone. We then need to give it a component name. Now, for this, all I'm going to do is call it testing, because we're not actually going to use it. Now, if I hit enter, this is then going to go ahead and generate our testing folder and the corresponding component. The typical behavior here is the Angular CLI will then go and add this to a particular module. Now, it hasn't done that because this is now a standalone component. So you can see we have a new component. We have this new property called standalone true. So at the moment, this is the default. If you want to create a standalone directive, component, or a pipe, you would add this flag. We also have this imports. So why do we have this common module added inside of here? So this allows us to now use things such as ngIf, ngClass, some of the directives, some of the pipes that we've used throughout our course in our app and our admin components. So this idea of a standalone component allows us to essentially get rid of our ng modules, but this does come at a more complex cost, because whereas an app module, for example, has things such as the browser module, which includes our common module, which is why we don't import it here. We have the router module, the HTTP client. Any component that is then registered in that module has access to all of those particular providers. So what we in fact need to do in a standalone component world is be far more explicit. So our imports list is going to include things such as ngIf, ng4of, ng-switch, ng-switch defaults, any pipes that we use, and so on. Now, one more thing that I want to show you is if we want to adopt a fully standalone component approach, you can jump into your angular.json. Once we're inside our angular.json, we have our schematics. Now, when the CLI generates a component, we already have some rules set up. We want to use inline templates, we want to use inline styles, we're using Sass, we're skipping tests for this course, so that's not generating any test files. Now, if you want to, we can add a new property. So this will then give us a standalone of true or false. If we then change this to true, we don't need to keep adding this dash dash standalone flag, and this will just automatically apply to all of our components. So that's a little bit of information for you for any future development that you do want to do with our standalone component API. Now, for the remainder of this course, we're going to see everything that this standalone API has to offer, and we're in fact going to piece by piece refactor our application and essentially remove those ng modules. Now, this you can consider a bolt-on to the course. What I don't want you to feel is that you've taken this course and you've thought about ng modules and get to the end and then all of a sudden we're just deleting them. That's not necessarily the case. As I've mentioned, ng modules are going to be here for a long, long time. That said, in the future, they may disappear. This is a developer preview. Even though it is in the brand new version of Angular, it's a different flavor and a different method for us to create Angular applications if this is the kind of syntax that you do prefer. There is, of course, much debate online about the mental models associated with ng modules. And in this chapter, we're then going to explore, compare, and look at the implications. And you can then decide for yourself whether you'd like to develop in a standalone style or an ng module style. So with this in mind, let's go ahead and delete our testing. We can then close off our other files. So what we're going to do for the remainder of this chapter, as I've mentioned, is slowly migrate away from using our ng modules. And this is going to then start with all the way from the bootstrapping phase. And in fact, we're going to use some of Angular's errors to give us a helping hand. And I'm going to walk through various scenarios, tips and tricks along the way, and some of the power that this standalone components and the standalone APIs can then give us.